There's something almost cinematic about watching a story, one that was so carefully crafted, so fiercely defended, start to unravel. And if you were Meghan Markle right now, staring at headlines that threaten to demolish the very foundation of your public image, how would you react? Would you feel that cold surge of panic in your chest, realizing that the fairy tale you'd spent years selling might finally be slipping through your fingers? Or would you be furious, calling in your team of crisis managers, drafting statements, weighing every possible response down to the last syllable? Because if there's one thing Meghan has mastered, it's the art of controlling a narrative. But this time, the narrative is fighting back. And it might be the first time in her entire post-royal life that she doesn't have the upper hand. Behind closed doors, you can almost picture it. Advisors shuffling in and out of rooms with folders and printouts. Harry pacing, rubbing his temples, maybe wondering if there's any way to spin this. Maybe Meghan is already rehearsing the next interview. The one where the lighting will be soft and the questions will be gentle, where she'll insist again that she's been misunderstood. But even her most loyal supporters have to admit, this isn't a simple misunderstanding. This is a direct contradiction from a hospital, backed by records, staff logs, and security cameras. You can imagine her weighing the options. Deny it outright and look defiant, ignore it and hope the story fades, or offer a vague explanation that satisfies no one. But the real danger isn't in choosing the wrong strategy. The real danger is that silence itself becomes an admission. And when you stay silent too long, people start writing the story for you. But to understand how it all came to this, to understand why Meghan's reaction matters so much, you have to look back at the version of events we were all told, the version that millions believed without question. When Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor entered the world, or so the official story went, it was presented as a perfect modern fairy tale. Meghan, the first biracial duchess in British royal history, had given birth to a healthy baby boy. Palace issued statements with just enough detail to feel legitimate, but not enough to satisfy the usual curiosity. There were no live broadcasts of her entering the hospital, no photos of her emerging with Archie in her arms. Just a brief announcement. Meghan was in labor. Then, hours later, another announcement. The baby was already here. In a world accustomed to royal tradition, where Diana and Kate stepped into the blinding flash of cameras to introduce their newborns, this was a jarring departure. But many people shrugged it off. They said Meghan and Harry deserved their privacy. They said times had changed and not everything needed to be public. For a while, that explanation worked. Of course, there were skeptics. A handful of observers pointed out that something about the timeline didn't feel right, that the announcements were too vague, too conveniently out of step with protocol. But most dismissed those concerns as the ramblings of conspiracy theorists, people who couldn't accept that a royal couple wanted to do things differently. And maybe that's exactly what Meghan was counting on, people's willingness to accept the simplest explanation. After all, if you tell a story confidently enough, most won't bother looking too closely at the details. But then came the revelation that no one expected, and no one in Meghan's camp seemed prepared to address. The very hospital she claimed to have delivered Archie in, Portland Hospital, came forward to say they had no record of her ever being there. No admission paperwork, no logbook entries, no security footage of Meghan entering or exiting, nothing. For a moment, it felt like the entire narrative had been pulled back to reveal an empty stage. Because if she wasn't there, the question becomes painfully obvious. Where was she? And what else about her story wasn't real? Think about that. For years, people believed Archie's birth was exactly what the palace said it was, a joyous, uncomplicated event in a prestigious medical facility. But with a single statement, the hospital flipped the script. Suddenly, the burden of proof was on Meghan and Harry to show that the story they sold to the world wasn't an elaborate fabrication. And if the location is in question, so is everything else. 'Cause a birth certificate without a hospital name isn't proof. A statement without documentation isn't evidence. And in a monarchy that runs on protocol, appearances, and documentation, the absence of all three is more than suspicious. It's explosive. But the hospital's denial wasn't the only red flag. If you look back at the timeline, you'll notice it never really made sense. On the morning of May 6, 2019, the palace announced Meghan had gone into labor. But by the afternoon, they declared Archie had already been born, hours earlier. No photographs surfaced of Meghan traveling to the hospital. No footage showed the couple arriving or departing. And while some tried to explain this away as a matter of privacy, the fact remains that every royal birth before hers had been, in some form, a public event. Even Princess Diana, who endured unimaginable pressure, stepped out onto those hospital steps. Kate Middleton did the same, 3 times over. Her hair perfectly styled despite having given birth just hours earlier. It was tradition, unwritten but sacred, and Meghan and Harry tossed it aside with little more than a polite press release. Different doesn't always mean suspicious, but when you pair an unprecedented level of secrecy with a complete absence of verifiable evidence, it doesn't just feel different, it feels deliberate. It feels like an attempt to control the story so completely that no one could ever question it. But people did question it. Quietly at first, then more openly as inconsistencies piled up. And nowhere were those inconsistencies more obvious than in the footage of Meghan's pregnancy. There are clips, many of them still available online, where her baby bump appears to change shape from one moment to the next. In one video it sits high and firm, in another it seems to sag or flatten as she sits. One particularly damning clip shows Meghan crouching to pick something up, and the bump folds in a way no real pregnancy ever would. At the time, defenders called it a wardrobe malfunction, an unfortunate angle. But now, with the hospital records, or lack thereof, casting a long shadow over every aspect of her narrative, those clips look less like coincidences and more like evidence. And yet, through all of this, Meghan remained silent. She didn't issue a denial. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't even send out a carefully worded statement about protecting her family's privacy. For someone who has built her entire public identity on the idea of speaking her truth, the silence was deafening. Some believe she was buying time, waiting for the news cycle to move on. Others think she was strategizing, preparing an exclusive interview to reclaim the narrative. But there's also a simpler, more unsettling possibility. That she stayed silent because she knew there was no safe way to answer. Because this isn't just about optics. It's not just about whether Meghan lied to make herself look better. It's about constitutional legitimacy. Archie isn't just her child. He's a member of the British royal family, a child whose place in the line of succession depends on the simple, provable fact that he was born to Meghan's body. That fact is in doubt, so is his title. So is every privilege and duty that comes with it. And in a monarchy where lineage is everything, that's not a small matter. That's a potential crisis. It wasn't long before insiders started whispering about another possibility. A possibility that, at first, sounded too sensational to be real. That Archie was born via surrogate, and that Meghan and Harry went to extraordinary lengths to hide it. Now, surrogacy isn't scandalous. Many high-profile women have chosen that path. It's a personal choice, one that deserves respect. But if Meghan did use a surrogate, why construct an elaborate performance? Why the maternity photos, the baby showers, the interviews describing pregnancy symptoms in detail? If she had been honest, the public would have understood. But staging a pregnancy is something else entirely. It's not about privacy, it's about deception. And that deception, if that's what this is, was never just aimed at the press. It was aimed at the public, at the institution of the monarchy itself, at every person who believed in her story. Because Meghan didn't simply share carefully curated glimpses of her life. She actively shaped a narrative that placed authenticity at its core. She was the woman who said she'd been silenced. The woman who said she was finally free to speak her truth. The woman who claimed every part of her story was her own. But the hospital statement, the folding bump, the missing timeline, they all suggest that maybe, just maybe, the truth was the one thing she never planned to share. If you were Harry, watching this unfold, how would you feel? Would you feel betrayed, complicit, or simply exhausted by the constant need to defend a story that never quite added up? Some say he always knew, that he agreed to the secrecy because he wanted to protect their privacy. Others believe he was as much a pawn in this narrative as anyone else, fed the same lines the public was. Either way, he's tied to this story forever, and as the questions grow louder, he'll be forced to decide whether to stand by it, or finally break ranks. Because the longer the silence drags on, the more people will fill in the blanks. And those blanks are getting bigger by the day. The old footage is resurfacing. Analysts are poring over every moment Meghan appeared in public with a shifting belly. Former royal staff are coming forward, anonymously at first, saying they were puzzled by the secrecy. Even then, the media is no longer content to let the matter fade away. Headlines are multiplying. Questions are becoming demands. What's striking is how preventable all of this was. Meghan could have been honest from the start. She could have said she chose surrogacy. She could have shared that detail in her own words, on her own terms, and most people would have respected her choice. But she didn't. Instead, she built a story so carefully staged that it looked perfect, until it didn't. And now, every element of her narrative is suspect. The mental health confessions, claims of being silenced, picture-perfect birth. When you discover that one part of a story might be fabricated, it becomes impossible not to question everything else. At the center of it all is Archie, a child who didn't ask for any of this, a child who will grow up with 1,000 conflicting versions of his own birth. One told by his mother, one told by the press, and one whispered by insiders behind closed doors. And that's the real tragedy, because no matter how this story ends, he's the one who'll carry its legacy. The truth has a way of coming out no matter how long it's buried. And in this case, the truth isn't just about a single birth certificate or a single hospital log. It's about whether an entire public persona was built on a lie. And if it was, if this was all a carefully constructed illusion, then everything Meghan has said since deserves a closer look. Because when you treat the truth like a PR strategy, you invite the world to pull back the curtain. And when the curtain falls, what's left isn't always a fairy tale. Sometimes it's just an empty stage. But what happens when the curtain falls and you realize you were part of the audience, applauding a performance you didn't know was scripted? That's the unsettling question playing out across social media, dinner tables, and newsrooms around the world. Because while the tabloids have always thrived on royal drama, this isn't just tabloid fodder anymore. This is something bigger, something more consequential. It's about trust, and whether the public has been misled on a scale that would make even the most cynical observer pause. Look closely at the timeline of Meghan's life in the royal spotlight, and you'll see a pattern emerging. Each chapter, each carefully timed revelation was designed to build her image as a modern, relatable woman who broke barriers and spoke her truth. The engagement interview where she smiled shyly and described meeting Harry. The wedding watched by millions, complete with a gospel choir and a sermon that hinted at change. The first pregnancy announcement, which was timed so precisely that it overshadowed a major royal event. Each moment was packaged in glossy perfection and sold to a public hungry for a new kind of royal story. But perfection has a price, because when every detail is curated to serve a narrative, there's no room for mistakes. There's no space for contradictions. And the moment a single crack appears, the entire facade begins to wobble. That's exactly what this hospital revelation has done. It hasn't just raised questions about one day in May 2019. It's made people reassess the entire story Meghan and Harry have told since the day they stepped away from royal duties. Consider the interviews. Time and again, Meghan described her pregnancy with vivid detail. How she felt, what she craved, the symptoms she battled. She spoke of the emotional toll of carrying Archie, the loneliness she felt, the fear of public scrutiny. And yet, if those stories were embellished or invented entirely, what does that say about the other claims she made? What does it say about the mental health struggles she described in that famous sit-down with Oprah? The most basic physical fact of her pregnancy is in question. How can the rest of her story stand unchallenged? Of course, there are people who will say none of this matters, that a woman's choice to carry a child herself or to use a surrogate is private, that no one should have to share the most intimate details of their life with strangers. And in theory, that's absolutely true. But the problem here isn't the method, it's the masquerade. It's the possibility that Meghan didn't just protect her privacy but actively misled the public, the press, and even the royal family itself. Because protecting your privacy is one thing, staging a performance is another. And if you think that sounds harsh, consider how much effort went into that performance. The flowing maternity gowns, public appearances timed to showcase a growing belly, the baby shower in New York, attended by celebrities where Meghan posed for photos as an expectant mother, carefully worded statements from the palace, which alluded to a conventional birth but never confirmed it outright. Each piece of the puzzle fits together to create an image so seamless that for years no one dared question it. Until now. Some have argued that the palace itself bears responsibility for this confusion. After all, the monarchy is built on precedent and protocol. If Meghan's birth story departed so radically from tradition, why didn't palace officials step in to clarify the facts? Truth is, they probably tried, behind closed doors. There are whispers that senior aides urged Harry and Meghan to release more information, to show the public that everything was above board. But Meghan, by many accounts, insisted on doing things her way. And in a royal family already wary of being accused of racism or favoritism, few were willing to push back too forcefully. So the palace issued statements that were deliberately vague, hoping that eventually the public would lose interest. That gamble worked for a while. But the problem with a vacuum of information is that eventually someone will fill it. And in this case, it was filled by internet sleuths, former staffers, and eventually a hospital willing to set the record straight. Once the hospital came forward, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Meghan. Because in a constitutional monarchy, every royal birth is a matter of public record. It isn't just a private family milestone. It's an event with legal and historical implications. If Archie's birth certificate is incomplete or misleading, that calls into question not just his place in the line of succession but also the credibility of the monarchy itself. And in a country already grappling with questions about the royal family's relevance, that's a dangerous precedent. Some constitutional experts have begun quietly speculating about what might happen if irrefutable proof emerged that Meghan didn't give birth herself. Would Archie's title be revoked? Would the Queen, or now the King, be forced to issue a statement correcting the record? Would Parliament be drawn into a constitutional debate over succession laws? No one knows for certain. But the very fact that those questions are being asked is proof of how serious this could become. Meanwhile, the public is left to piece together the truth from scraps of information. Every day, new clips and photos are circulating online. In one, Meghan steps out of a car and her belly appears unusually high on her torso, almost as if it's been strapped in place. In another, she bends to greet a child and the bump shifts unnaturally to one side. For years, those images were explained away as optical illusions. But now, viewed through the lens of the hospital's statement, they look like something else entirely, evidence of a carefully planned deception. And yet, despite the mounting questions, Meghan remains silent. No denials, no clarifications, no interviews. Some say this is because she's been advised that any comment could create legal jeopardy if it later proves untrue. Others think she's simply hoping the story will fade under the weight of the next big scandal. But the problem with silence is that it rarely soothes suspicion. If anything, it inflames it. Harry, too, has stayed quiet. And that silence may be the most puzzling of all. 'Cause whatever else you can say about him, he has always been fiercely protective of his family. If there were a simple, innocent explanation for all of this, wouldn't he have stepped forward to defend his wife? Wouldn't he have issued a statement reaffirming the official version of events? The fact that he hasn't has only deepened the sense that something isn't right. And in the absence of answers, people have begun to wonder whether this is just the tip of the iceberg. If Meghan lied about something as fundamental as giving birth, what else might she have concealed? Was the famous Oprah interview, where she claimed she was denied help for her mental health, entirely truthful? Were the stories of being silenced and marginalized as dramatic as they sounded? Or were they carefully crafted to win sympathy? To position Meghan as the ultimate underdog in a family of cold, unfeeling aristocrats? To be clear, not all criticism of Meghan is fair. She has endured racism, misogyny, and the relentless scrutiny of a media machine that often cross the line. But enduring unfair treatment doesn't automatically mean you're always telling the truth. And in this case, the stakes are simply too high to give her a pass. Because at the heart of this scandal is a child, Archie, whose very identity has become a lightning rod for speculation and doubt. No matter how this story unfolds, he will grow up knowing that his birth was surrounded by controversy. He will have to reconcile the version of events his mother told the world with the questions she refused to answer. And that's a burden no child deserves. What's even more tragic is that it didn't have to be this way. Meghan could have trusted the public with the truth. She could have acknowledged that surrogacy was part of her story. She could have reframed it as an act of empowerment rather than something to hide. Instead, she chose secrecy, performance, and silence. And in doing so, she gave her critics the very ammunition they needed to tear her narrative apart. Now, as the palace weighs its options and the public waits for answers, one thing is certain. The storm isn't going away. It's only getting stronger. Because every day Meghan remains silent is another day people are left to wonder. Another day journalists dig deeper. Another day the questions pile up. And as those questions grow louder, they threaten not just Meghan's reputation but the credibility of the entire institution she married into. The monarchy has survived abdications, divorces, and scandals. But it has never faced an allegation quite like this. An allegation that a royal birth was staged to protect an image rather than preserve the truth. In the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just one woman's ambition or one family's secrets. It's about the idea that truth matters, that no amount of branding can erase the facts, that eventually reality catches up to even the most carefully crafted fairy tale. So as the headlines keep coming and the footage keeps resurfacing, the world is left to ask the question Meghan hoped no one would ever dare to voice out loud. If this was all a lie, if the pregnancy, the birth, the photos were staged, what else was she willing to fabricate? What other truths were sacrificed on the altar of image? And perhaps more importantly, why did she believe the public would never find out? Because in the end, the most dangerous deception isn't the one you tell others. It's the one you convince yourself is necessary. The one you build an entire identity around. The one you defend until the bitter end. And when that deception collapses, as it seems to be collapsing now, what's left behind is not just embarrassment. It's the slow, public dismantling of everything you claim to stand for. That's the price of hiding the truth behind a smile, a photo op, and a perfectly worded press release. That's the cost of turning authenticity into a brand rather than a principle. And as the palace, the press, and the public all wait for Meghan to finally speak, one reality is becoming clearer than ever. Silence doesn't protect the truth. It only delays it. And the longer she waits, the more unforgiving the truth will be when it finally comes out.